Hello, friends of the paranormal. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you today?
I am good. I'm grateful. Just grateful to the world for everything I have.
There's probably not enough of that going around.
Yep.
So, all right. If you are just finding us, just joining us, we thank you. If please consider clicking the subscribe or the like, thumbs up, whichever platform that you're on. If you're coming back, we thank you again. And I do want to say there have been a couple comments on our Spotify side of things, which I have a more difficult time sending to you. So I'll try to do that. But we've had
Okay.
some comments on those, and I try to reply to those when I can. Down below in the description, there'll be our email address and anything else Paranormalist Podcast related. And we took a week off. I apologize for that. Circumstances beyond our control. And so I'm a little out of practice, but I think I covered everything we do.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. And now's where I ask, what's our topic?
So our topic today is angels. Now, I want to make a note that this is about a week and a half after Hurricane Helene, and I was going to do dark stuff because we were coming towards Halloween, but there's just enough darkness in the universe right now that the last thing we need is more darkness in our thoughts at this point in time. So I started out, as I told Stu this morning, with the idea of doing angels, and I've rewritten this particular podcast 3 times today because I wanted it to be a certain way, and I think I've gotten as close as I'm going to get, guys. So with that, I wanted to start. I chose a lot of these stories, some of them because they really speak to me. The first story is one of those. I wanted to I'll tell you the story first, and then I'll tell you why it spoke to me. So this is a story about from a young woman who said that she was driving home from work. It was torrential rain. She could barely see, and she couldn't even make out the road. We've all had those moments when we're driving, and like even the fastest, the windshield wipers can't keep up. You're looking for a place to go or trying not to hydroplane. You're just scared. And that's exactly where she was at. And she said all of a sudden, her brain was in the, oh my gosh, I'm going to crash. I can't find a place. And all of a sudden, this warm, calming emotion just wrapped around her. And she heard a voice say, "You are safe. Just let go." And she said, I don't know why, but I trusted the voice. I lifted my hands off the steering wheel, and the car came to a stop without hitting anything. I realized there was a small spot I could pull over at just that place. And I quickly pulled off the road and paused, and I turned the car off, and I laid my forehead on the steering wheel and said, "Thank you." And she said, "All I can tell you is I know for a fact that somebody else took the wheel and brought me to stop in the place that I couldn't see because it was too much rain. Had I been driving, I would have went past it, and heaven truly only knows what would have happened to me. But I believe that my guardian angel took the wheel and gave me comfort and gave me safety." Now, the reason that story speaks to me, and I might have mentioned it somewhere along in my life, but if I did, I apologize. Many, many years ago, we only had one car, and I was supposed to come and get my husband from work. In the back seat was my oldest son, who was at that time about 2 years old. And it was a terrible snowy day. And we had had a couple phone conversations that day about the weather, and I was afraid to come get him because it was a 24-mile drive. Because from where I live, everything's 24 miles. It's just how it works, okay, or more.
Okay. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And so he kept saying, "You need to get me. You need to come and get me. I don't have any place to stay tonight. I don't have any way to take transport to get me there." His dad was working, so I couldn't appeal to his father. And I was like, I gotta go get him. And I'm driving, and the roads were very slick. And I left like an hour and a half early. I'm doing that 5 miles an hour. Cars are pulled off everywhere. Lights are going. Plows are, not even out moving yet. And for those who don't live in Pennsylvania, they tend to like not plow till it's over, except maybe a couple large arteries to keep them open. And Nothing I live around has a large artery for traffic. And so it's like these little 2-lane roads, right, in the middle of nowhere. And I get probably 2/3 of the way there, and the car slides, and I'm terrified, and I'm crying now. And I have never been in more of a fit of fear in my life. And because my son's in the back seat, I had nowhere to leave him, so he's with me. And I remember we passed this old school, and all of a sudden I just said, and I said out loud, I said, God, I can't do this. I can't do this. I can't do this. And I'm just muttering, I can't do this. I don't remember anything from that moment until I pulled into where my husband worked. I don't remember driving it. I don't remember how we got there. I can't tell you anything about it other than I remember seeing that old school and sliding and just screaming, I can't do this, I can't do this. And somehow safely we made it there. So this story, I kind of got that vibe off of it, and it reminded me of that. And so I wanted to start with that story. And a lot of the angel stories you read or you hear come from hospitals, hospice, nursing facilities, nursing homes. You hear a lot of those stories in there. And so for those who don't know, I was a CNA for about 18 years. And I did both in nursing homes, I did private care. And so I also did hospice at the end the last couple years. So there were a lot of stories. And this is a story that sort of touched me. This is a story that was told by the person it happened to. In 1994, this particular woman was in acute pain from a fibroid tumor. It was the size of a grapefruit in her uterus. And they had removed it, but unfortunately, there were also added complications after that. So they still thought she was going to pass. She was in a lot of pain. She was allergic to some of the best pain medicines. So there really was not a whole lot they could do but try to keep her unconscious. It's called snowing, excuse me, snowing, and hospitals and nursing homes and stuff do it all the time. They just keep you semi-conscious because it helps you to avoid the pain. And in most instances, it's done out of mercy. So they were trying to do that. And she just was in a really bad state, and they had her about 2/3 of the way out. She finally fell asleep, and when she woke up, it was the middle of the night. She said she could remember seeing the glowing clock on the wall, and it said 2:45 a.m. And she realized there was somebody sitting in the chair beside her bed. And she kind of rolled her head over to look, and the woman was a young woman. She had brown hair. She was wearing a nursing uniform, and she was sitting there reading the Bible out loud to this woman. And she said, you're okay, sweetheart. And as though she recognized the woman was awake in the darkness. And the woman said to her, am I all right? Why are you here with me? Because she's concerned that they thought she was going to die, because they'll set somebody with you a lot of times, to keep a watch. And the woman said, I was sent here to make sure you're okay. Now you're going to be fine. You'll need some rest. And then I want you to go, after you go back to sleep, when you wake up, you'll feel better. The next morning, she woke up. She felt a lot better. The pain had eased. The antibiotics had gotten rid of some of that infection. And the doctors came in to check her, and she told them about the nurse who had been so kind the night before. And when you're sick and suffering, the gratitude you have toward the people who are trying to help you is so profound. I've witnessed it 1,000 times. And I've experienced it a couple times when I've been seriously ill. And he said, well, I don't know who that would be. So she asked one of the nurses, who was the nurse who was sitting in here with me last night. And they checked the charts, and there was nobody in there with her, or there shouldn't have been anybody in there. There was nobody logged in as an assignment to watch over her. And they were really puzzled, but there's no answer. And she said, I don't really know what the answer is, except that I believe that an angel came and sat with me to give me comfort because I was so frightened I was dying. And they kind of gave me, the information about how it was going to work. And it worked exactly that way. And of course, I've told the story before about when my son was so ill. And the maintenance man, who wasn't really a
Mhm.
maintenance man,
Mhm.
came into the room I was in and gave me all this information on who the doctor was and how the doctor was going to come and talk to me. And what he was telling me was completely different than what the nursing staff had told me. And yet everything that this maintenance man told me happened exactly the way the maintenance man said. And I went to thank him by finding him the next day for his comfort and his help, because I got that sense of peace and calm,
Right.
and he didn't exist. Like the staff there, nobody knew who he was. Even the lady that hired everybody for that hospital for the last 25 years didn't know who I was talking about. So I've told that story in another episode, and if they look around, I'm sure we can figure it out sometime. But I just thought it was an amazing story, and it was so hopeful.
And you know what my takeaway from that one was, if it was dark, she saw the clock and the only illumination was from the clock, and she would have a hard time seeing who was in the chair. How could the person in the chair be reading the Bible in the dark unless they knew it word for word?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's great.
Hmm.
Hadn't thought of that, but that's a great observation. Now, my next story is a little more, it's a little different, and I think it's going to foreshadow something that's coming later on. So this took place in California in the early 2000s. A gentleman was coming out to his car in his apartment parking lot, and when he gets close, he sees a guy on his knees in front of his, beside his car, and he gets a little closer and he yells, "Hey, what are you doing to my car?" The guy stands up. He's a young man. He's got a crowbar in one hand. Now, me personally, I would have headed in the right other direction and called for help. This guy was angry and not thinking. We do a lot of stupid things when we're not thinking because we're angry or upset in life. And he kept coming toward this guy, and he gets closer and he can see that the steering column in his car had been separated open, and the door of his car was unlatched. So whoever this guy was, he was trying to steal the car, and hotwire it. And he yelled and he said, "You were trying to steal my car." And the kid says, "No, I wasn't. No, like my buddy's car looked like this one and it was stolen last night. And I thought it was his car and I was going to take it back to him." Basically admitting he was hot wiring the car, you know, but he had this good
Hmm.
excuse for why. So anyway, he said it dawned on him that he had just done something really stupid. He's within maybe 6 or 7 feet of this kid who has a crowbar, and you can tell he's the kid's looking around. He's like trying to find a way to exit or whatever, and the guy grabs his phone and he steps back a couple of steps and he says, "You're going to stay put and I'm calling the police." So he calls 911, gives an address, and the kid's like, "I ain't going to be here." And he's like, "You know what, go, they'll find you." And at just that moment, in the sky above, 3 white clouds drop down, and they're huge, white, and lit from inside. And I want to I want to read exactly what this guy said, because I will not do it justice. He said, "There against the richness of the blue sky was a silvery shape that seemed to have arms and legs that left the first cloud and went from it into the second cloud, and then from the second cloud to the third cloud." He said, "It was so beautiful to look at. At the same time, it had the appearance of metal. It looked like some kind of ship or with a strange design. The best way I can describe it is it looked like silverware in the design of a stickman child drawing. It was huge, fast moving. It made no noise. It sailed overhead, and some of the limbs moved up and down, giving the impression of it being alive, a living entity. It made a couple rolls, reflecting the sun in every direction. Just beautiful. Oh my God, so beautiful." As it started to fade away from my view, I found myself short of breath, tears running down my cheeks. It had such an effect on me, and I began to think that what I was looking at was an angel. The young man bolted and ran, and it didn't matter at that moment in time. This man was so profoundly moved, and later he would think that whatever this thing was had allowed him to be distracted and feel peace in a way that was so profound. And it also gave that boy a chance to leave rather than use that crowbar against him. That had to be amazing. Um, I'm going to go way back in history, because I know a lot of people will argue that the stories of angelic beings are just religious, that these were really UFOs that have always been here, blah, blah, blah. But I want to tell a story about a sighting. There was, this was 1602, and this gentleman was traveling, he was the vicar of, a friend of the vicar of Flint, a little town in Europe. And it was really cold. He's in a sleigh. He's got three friends with him, and they're moving along through the snow trying to get to their destination because it had to be bitter cold. It's the middle of winter. And he said it was when they came across a young woman out in the frosty cold. It was frigid, and the girl was inadequately dressed. She was just standing along the road out in the middle of nowhere, and they hadn't seen her seconds before. So they pull the sleigh to a stop, and they offer her a ride. She doesn't say a word, but she nods, and she climbs into the sleigh. He said that's when things got very strange. She took the robes that they covered her with because she was inadequately dressed. So they always had lap robes and, furs that they could wrap up in to stay warm. So they tried to cover her up in some of this so she could be warm. A little way up the road, they came across an inn, and they decided to go in and warm up. The young woman went in, and she still hadn't spoken a word. One of the gentlemen, to be a gentleman, ordered her a mug of beer. In the Middle Ages, everybody drank beer rather than water because water was contaminated. And as soon as the drink was set in front of her, it turned into malt. And they were sitting there in absolute, sheer like panic. What do you do with this? And one of the men said, I think you put the wrong thing in front of the young lady. Get her another beer. The second beer was turned into a cup of acorns. No mistaking that. The third beer was grasped by the girl. She picked up the mug, and when she did, it turned to blood. She sat it down and looked directly at them, still having not spoken a word. She tipped the mug so they could see the blood, and she said, there will be good crops this year. There will be enough fruits of the trees. There will also be many wars and many plagues this year. And then she vanished before their astonished eyes and the eyes of every other man and woman in the inn. True to her word, everything she prophesied came to fruition. So she was a harbinger of what was to come and a warning for them to be prepared. They believed she was an angel. And that was in 1602. These stories were happening in just such amazing ways. There's a story we did cover in one of our early podcasts about George Washington at Valley Forge. And he was in the depths of despair. The war was being lost. It was bitter cold. The men were dying from the cold much more than they were dying from the battles. They said literally you could follow the men by the bloody trail from their footprints. They had no boots. They were wrapping their feet in leather and cloth and whatever they had. And he knew he had inadequate food. He couldn't continue this battle this way. He just couldn't continue a war this way. And he went into a Great Depression, and he went to the second floor of the housing that he was in. And one of his aides would later write this, where he came down after a couple days. He was disheveled and excited, and he told this crazy story about how an angel came to him, and she poured from her cup this fluid, and the wall opened up, and he could see the events that were about to transpire. And she told him how things would work, not just with the war, but with the Republic, and how it would come on great times and sorrowful times, and that it would almost die, but would rise again. And that gave him the hope to continue, because he knew that the angel had told him that. And I thought about that story when I read this one. So I'm going to tell a story about an angelic hitchhiker. We never know who we have in our presence. The Bible tells us that the stranger could just as well be an angel you're entertaining. And I thought this was really an interesting story. So this young man is headed to work one morning. He's in the heavy traffic you get early in the day, that gridlock going into the city and what have you, that so many people have to fight. He saw a man standing beside the road. It was raining and cool, and the guy was hitchhiking, and he had this bag, like a duffel, that looked really heavy. It looked full. So the man pulled over and he out of pity and he said, "Where are you going?" And the stranger jumped in the car and he's like, "Into the city." And he's like, "Well, I don't know where you're going once you get there, but I can at least get you that far." And they talked a little bit. They talked about life, about, work, about all of this stuff. And they're headed towards the city. And there's this one stretch where it's like a woodland, and then from that you kind of get dumped into the entrances to the turnoffs for the city. So he's in that place where it's kind of woodland and empty fields. And the hitchhiker says to the man, "You can just drop me off right here." And the guy pulls over and he's like, "Dude, you said you were headed for the city. There ain't nothing out here." And he's like, "It's okay." And he says, "Dad," this guy turns around and looks out the window, and like all he sees is some trees in the distance and a empty field that's been cut, and there's nothing, just nothing but woods and field. And he turns back and the guy is gone. And he sees the duffel bag is still laying there in his seat. So he jumps out of the car and he yells, "Hey, sir, hey, mister, you forgot your bag. You forgot your bag." And he said it felt really light, although it had looked so heavy when the man was holding it along the road. He opens it up and it's completely empty. There's nothing in it. He puts it back in the car and feeling very kind of disconcerted by the whole situation, starts driving forward. And when he gets further up the road, he realizes that there's this really horrible accident. Had he not slowed down to help this man, had he not paused at that field, he would have been directly in the middle of that wreck. It was a multi-car wreck. The man who tells the story is actually the son of the man to whom this happened. And he said, "My dad saved the hitchhiker guy's bag. He carries it in every car he's ever driven. He says one day he'll see him again and return it. I'm not sure if he means on this side of heaven or the other." But I just thought that was a really beautiful story. Sometimes, not pursuing things is better for us than when we pursue them, because maybe we're being slowed down because we have a reason we need to be. I thought this was an interesting little story because I've had family and friends who've had these experiences. So I wanted to share this story. This is a story that took place in 2009. This couple was on their way home, and this was in Ohio, and there's like a four-way, and a truck came barreling out of the four-way. It was not a traffic light. It was one of those stop signs where everybody has to be polite. You know what I'm talking about?
Yep, I do.
And usually everybody stops and then somebody waves the other person on and we go. That's how it works, because mostly where I live at, there's literally two stoplights in my entire county. That's it. So we have a lot of those four ways. But anyhow, they were on their way home when suddenly this truck comes barreling up the road, never slows down at the stop sign, and broadsides them. And they're, skittering down the road, lost control of the vehicle, the whole 9 yards. And the woman screams, the husband's wrestling the thing, but his side's the side that got hit, and he's struggling. They spin around, they hit the telephone pole. Her side of the car gets jammed with the door smashed in now because of the telephone pole, and they skitter to a stop. Other people are around. They see what happened. The truck is, sitting there all bashed in the front end of it and everything. And it was just crazy. People come running to help. Somebody calls 911. And the next thing she remembers, she's standing off a distance away from the accident. And somebody walked up to her and said, "Aren't you the lady that just got out of that car?" And she said, "Yes." And they said, "How did you get out? The doors smashed in. The windshield was still shattered, but you couldn't climb through it." And she said, "I don't remember that. All I remember is I saw a dark shadow in front of me and it lifted me free. And then I passed out. And when I woke up, I was standing there, and as she's looking around, she sees the dark shadow one more time, and she said, in silhouette, it looked like a man, just the shape of a man in general, and it faded away. And she said, I can't tell you how I got out of that car, but I literally teleported because there's no other explanation. They had to use the jaws of life to get her husband out. And I've had a family member tell me a very similar story. So it struck me as really interesting. And sometimes we go through rough waters and we think we're making bad decisions because we're doing the right thing, but it's not working. You know what I'm saying? Like a lot of times when a person becomes a Christian, all of a sudden everything kind of falls apart in their life. And they're like, why? I'm being a good person now. Why are you doing this to me? And sometimes it's because there's other forces afoot that want to defeat you. And I truly believe that, and I've seen that in my own life. And I thought I love this story. So this was actually told, and this was not actually even in the United States. It was a story I came across of a woman doing some reminiscences, and she was from Nigeria, and she tells the story that her mother in 1987 became a Christian. She had been a member of a kind of a cult. She did pagan worship and stuff like that, and she had become a Christian. She got rid of all of her stuff, her protective charms, her amulets, all that crap that they had, whatever, and she picked up her faith in Christ. And as soon as she did, she was a very well-to-do woman. She had tons of businesses and money, and she was very well-to-do, and everything just started to go to crap. And the woman was beginning to doubt herself, like she was losing money. She had apartment buildings that she now couldn't rent apartments in because there were problems in the buildings that hadn't existed 6 weeks ago. And just like everything was falling apart. All her investments were falling apart. Everything was falling apart financially. And she was struggling, and she thought, maybe I'm made a bad choice. Maybe I'm making mistakes. But she was sticking to it, and she decided instead of giving in, she was going to go get baptized. And they had, at this church, they had baptismal classes so that you could understand what you were doing. And she was walking home one night from a baptismal class when she got near her home, and out of nowhere stepped a man, an older gentleman, and he spoke her native language. And he said that there was somebody prominent who was using intensive prayers and to curse her, to give her spiritual attack and bring misfortune because she had left their group. And he scared her a little because she didn't know who he was, but he seemed to know so much about her and her life that it was a little awkward. And then he said to her, you need to stay calm. Don't be afraid. Stay your course. And she said a sense of peace came over my mother, and she would describe it as the knowledge that all was well. Like we say things like God's got it, but we don't believe it because we go, oh, God's got it. And then we're like, oh, yeah, but please, God, can you please fix it, please? Because we don't think he really got it. But she thought he got it. This man was saying God's got it. So she stuck by what she was believing was true, and she went on and on and on, doing what she was doing. And eventually her integrity, the fact that people were witnessing her being a different person, changed things. The woman only died in 2022. She was 79 years old. She testified to this story about how this changed her life. And she would tell people she believed that gentleman was an angel, her angel, giving her kind of a pep talk, telling her to like stick it out and get through it. And these things are going to happen, but it's going to be okay. And I thought that was just so cool. And I'm kind of zipping up here a little bit. This will not be like our longest podcast, not because I don't have a ton of stories, but because I think there's just so many more things to say. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the angel of death. Again, is something I've brought up more than one time. I have actually met an angel of death, and I've told the story before. And I said, as I said at the beginning, I was a caregiver for people who were terminally ill. And this woman, it was also a caregiver. Her name was Joan Reisling, and she tells this wonderful story that I wanted to share with you. She was a caregiver in hospice facility, and she um, formed a great love for one of her patients. And anybody who can tell you that they can love these people through death and not become emotionally impacted are either a liar or they're a completely different species of human than I am, because that was never the case for me. I grew to love every one of my people because I'm there daily. I'm washing them, I'm feeding them, I'm talking to them, sharing their memories. And that's how it was for this lady, you know? Like there's some people that are just you're closer to than others, but you care for all of them. So it was at the very end of this particular patient's life when she had been in and out of being lucid. And when she was lucid, she would talk about, um, you know, what is death like? And I'm afraid. And you would hear that sometimes from people, I'm afraid. And I understand that. Nobody knows truly what it's like until you get there. And on this one morning, she came into the room and the person was laying in bed. It was just, you know, that beautiful early morning light coming through the blinds, and it was kind of making the room well lit, well enough she didn't have to turn on a light to get over to the window to pull the curtains open and all the stuff you do in a room for a patient. And as she walked through the room, she saw a woman sitting next to him or next to the patient on the bed. And the woman said, "Please let the blinds stay closed." She said, "I turned and looked, and I could have swore the woman's lips never moved, but I could hear her voice." She was very pale, she was thin, and she said from one angle, her skin looked almost like she was a skeleton, but from another angle, you could see she was just very thin, and she had sunken cheekbones. She said, "I stopped in awe. I wasn't afraid. I don't know why, but I stood there by the window watching her." And her patient opened their eyes, and seeing the nurse had come in, he said, "Good morning, Joan." And then he looked at the woman who was sitting beside him and he said, "Isn't she beautiful? How can anybody be afraid of the angel of death?" And the woman, Joan, said, "I felt tears well up in my eyes. I knew what was going on. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. But I knew what was about to happen." And the woman laid her hand on top of the man's heart and pressed down gently, and just very gently. And she said, as this angel did this, I could feel the force of my patient draining out of the body and into her. And I could hear the heart monitor, and it was going from beep, beep, beep to flatline. And the alarm sounded. And it was only a second before people were rushing into the room. And I looked at them, and then I looked at the bed, and the woman was gone. And my patient was laying there, and there was a smile on the patient's face. And she said, after that, I waited to see this being again, and I've never seen it. And she's like, it was bittersweet. I wanted to let my patient live, and I knew my patient couldn't. That's the dichotomy of doing
Mhm.
hospice. But she said there was like a comfort in seeing the passing because it wasn't ugly. It was gentle and kind, and you knew that the essence of who he was being carried forward somewhere. And I really understood that because I've had maybe not moments of seeing that, but I've held people when they died, and you can feel them leave the body. I don't know how else to explain it. And quite often they would tell me things like, there's a person in the room, something like that. And I know I told a story about my great grandmother dying, and um, she kept saying she could hear the angels sing. Could you hear the angels sing to my grandfather and grandmother? And they saw the angel as she passed away. And I just thought that was so much like my family story. These are the stories of what really happens in life. And I just found it really interesting. This is a story of a couple who were married for 30 years, and they're from Pensacola, Florida. The gentleman's name is Danny. And Danny's tending his wife. She's in the last stages of a disease and she had cancer. And most of the time she wasn't lucid. For about a week, she was pretty much not lucid. And he woke up one night sitting in a chair beside her, and she was sitting up in the bed. This was the first time she had been really conscious in quite a while. And she was looking at something at the foot of the bed. And he said he turned his head to look, and there was this immense darkness that was forming into what looked like a human shape right before their eyes. And at the moment, the air in the room grew cool, it became difficult to breathe. And his wife turned to him and whispered to him, "Danny, I think he's come for me. I want to go now. It's time to let me go." And he said, I started to cry. I held her hand and I pleaded to her, "Don't go, don't go." I kissed her hand, and when I pulled back, the figure on the other side on the foot of the bed had moved up and was holding her other hand. And he said it wasn't fingers I saw, but tendrils of mist wrapped around her hand. And she was fading, and as she faded, the figure grew brighter, stronger, more vivid. And I could tell that her life essence was leaving her body and going with him. And every time she would breathe, it was more shallow, and then he would glow, more until there was no movement. And as soon as the movement stopped, the being gently laid her hand down. And he said, I looked at my wife's face. She was smiling. And I knew when I looked up, he would be gone. And he was. And he said, I understood that death is not to be feared, nor is it an unmerciful persona. It is people's understanding of death's role in life that is misunderstood. And until one has walked in mine and my wife's path, this is hard to conceive. But death does not steal life away like a thief in the night. Death relieves us of flesh worn, torn, and weary from the strains of living in a disposable shell. I no longer fear death, and I am not sorry he came to take my wife. I was just really blown away by that particular story. And I'm going to tell one more death story, and then I'm going to move on to something completely different, angel-wise. This is a story told by a gentleman who at the time was living in New York City. His name was Derek Cabarill. And it's 2 o'clock in the morning. He's in the subway trying to get home from his job. At this time of the night, there's very few people in the subway. He's alone in a car with an old man who's sitting on a bench on the other side of the car. And he said just by looking at him, you could tell this guy was a homeless person, possibly an addict of some sort. He was wasted. It was dirty. He was weak looking, and very, very gaunt. And he said, I could see that there was death was near. His fingernails were blue-black, which is cyanotic, meaning there's lack of oxygen getting into him. And he was, just struggling. It's a sad thing to see. And he said, I didn't know what to do, so I just picked up my newspaper and pretended I didn't see. Boy, how many people do that?
On the subway, no less, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he said after a few seconds, he folded down the edge of the newspaper and looked, and there was another man sitting beside the old homeless man. And he said this man, he was different. He's like, the first thing I thought is I never heard the door open for somebody else to enter. We had never stopped to pick up any more people. And this incredible cold ran up my spine. He said, because he was just shocked to see this man standing there or sitting there beside him. He said, and then this man leaned over the old man, and he said, as I saw him lean over, the lights died in the car. And I didn't know what to do. Like, is he leaning over him to mug him? What's going on? And he said, the lights flickered for a few seconds, and when they came back on, I could see that the man was gone. the man who had been sitting there leaning over top of him. And he said, I could also see that the homeless man was gone. His eyes were open, his mouth was open. He was leaning back, drooping in the seat, and I knew he was dead. There was a smile on his face, and he said, I was shocked because death was gentle. There was no harshness. There was this incredible, awesome energy of some type that frightened and attracted me at the same time. And I can still see this man's eyes in the darkness, because right before he leaned over that old man, he looked directly at me, and that's when I had to look away.
Every experience can't be like that, though, because there are people who, died violently and under less than perfect situations.
I have to tell you, I agree there's people who die violently and under really terrible circumstances. And some of these folks died kind of not violently, but under terrible circumstances. Watching a person die of cancer is really painful because they go through so much immense pain toward the end of their life. But I have a belief that once we pass, for most of us, that concept of vengeance or of anger or whatever falls away. Like, I know stories where people have died, been murdered, and what have you, and families have come to try to find ways to catch the murderer. And there is a series of events that I know of in particular that illustrate this, where they literally were trying to talk to her, and it was the woman's daughter's voice, and the daughter who had been murdered said on record, I mean, like, they recorded it, when they said, "Who killed you?" The response was, "Doesn't matter. I'm okay now. Let it go. Live." So the actions that take the life might be violent, but I think the moment of death is not. Like, when they step out of the body, that the angel of death is kindness. And as I told you, in my experience, I just felt the most immense love I'd ever felt in my life. I cried for a solid hour the whole time this entire thing was going on. I cried for a solid hour. And then after that, it took me a long time to calm down. I wasn't angry. I wasn't scared. I was just overwhelmed. I have never felt that sense of love in my entire life. So I'm hoping that when death comes, it gives us that sense of love. And so no matter how tragic the circumstances are, once you're done with that process, they pick you up gently and take you on. And I wanted to share one last story before we end this. This is probably one of the most amazing stories I've ever read in my life, and that's saying something. So in April of in 1971, in the Soviet Union, they were building these space stations. And the first set of space stations were called Soyuz 7 space stations. So it was Soyuz 1 through 7. And in 1982, Soyuz 7 space station was launched. It was launched with 3 male cosmonauts who were highly experienced. And one of the reasons that they were doing this is they were experimenting with figuring out how to, in space, send other pods up that could connect to the central pod and build like cities. And there were also scientific experiments these guys were supposed to do. These were very highly trained men. And this would be the last of the Soviet space stations. They would move from that to the Mir space stations, which we're more familiar with today. And it was going to stay, and it would end up staying in orbit for 8 years and 10 months before Soyuz 7 was returned and abandoned by the cosmonauts. Now, that's a really interesting piece of information, but like, what does it have to do with anything else? It has to do with angels, because a series of exceedingly bizarre events happened to the crews of that particular space station. It took until the end of the Soviet Union for the stories to leak out, but they have leaked out. And they did, and they made it around the world in newspapers eventually. So it was July of 1984. Salyut 7 was on its 155th day of its mission. Everything was kind of going along the way it was supposed to. I'm going to butcher these names, but at the time, the three cosmonauts who were there were Oleg Akov, Vladimir Solovoyk, and Leonid Kinsk. I hope I didn't do too badly. And they were, just doing their thing, running experiments, checking all the gauges and what have you, like doing their thing. All of a sudden, this blinding orange light that's so bright you can almost, it hurts your eyes, suddenly burst around outside. And you could see it through the windows. Their first thought was, oh my gosh, something's on fire. Something's going to blow up. Something's overheated. Something's going on and it's bad. So they ran to the windows to look, and they all saw the same thing. This beautiful, brilliant orange glow of light. And I'm going to read it the way they described it. They're hovering in space in front of the station were 7 enormous winged humanoid beings, approximately 90 feet in height, and with a calm, smiling face. It was from these bizarre beings that this ethereal light was apparently emanating. They were exuding a calm and peacefulness that consumed us, and we felt no fear, just wonderment. These colossal apparitions, which we believe were angels, matched the speed of our space station and remained in the same position for about 10 minutes before fading away. They had the most beneficent smiles on their faces, and we knew they meant us no harm. Now, when they first saw the orange light, they immediately radioed down to the Earth to say, hey, there's a problem up here. We don't know what it is. They wanted somebody to know what was going on. So
Right.
now, of course, they've got ground control, and they're like, hey, what's going on? Is everybody okay? We don't have any readings that are showing us there's anything wrong. And the guys are like, hey, no, it's false alarm. And they decided to talk about it amongst themselves and then decide what to do. Because who's going to believe that 3 cosmonauts saw angels in the sky? And they didn't want to ruin their reputations. And this wasn't the kind of thing you said to the Kremlin, you know? So like they had heated discussions on what the beings were. Is there a rational explanation? Did we share a hallucination? Maybe we should just not tell anybody anything about it. Maybe it was stress induced. They came up with everything. Our minds were playing tricks. They do write it down, and they do keep a record. On the 167th day, the Salyut 7 gained 3 additional cosmonauts. Svetlinka Savakova, who was the very first woman in space, Igor Volk, and Vladimir, this one's going to be hard, Dimba Bipkov. These were 3 new members, also completely, trained to be up there. They've been vetted. They've got mental health has been looked at, all these different things, because, you're stuck up there. They don't know how this is going to end. So they wanted to make sure everybody was in the best mental health and the best physical health and emotional health and all of that. And when these people boarded, they were there for a couple days, and then they're on the station working when all of a sudden that bright, brilliant orange light envelops the space station outside again. All 6 of them run to windows to look out. And I'm going to again read. It says, once again, the station was bathed in the potent, bedazzling light. All 6 of us crewmen looked out the portholes to see several massive angelic beings swimming through the blackness of space outside, again with their benevolent, smiling faces. This time, it was the same thing. It had happened. All 6 of us had seen it. It couldn't be a simple hallucination. These people weren't under the amount of stress we had been. They had just arrived. Now, when these people all came down to Earth, and when their time was over and they were replaced, they did tell their handlers. and it was covered up in the Soviet government, as I said. It didn't get a whole lot of coverage until the fall of the Soviet Union. And at that point, a lot of, there's actually entire books of paranormal records. The Soviets were really interested in the paranormal. So, on many levels, they thought that it might be, useful to control people, communicate. They might be able to could get entities, the angels, demons, whatever, that they could interface with and become allies with. Like there's tens of thousands of documents about all of this. So somebody kept the story alive. And then whenever all the documents fell, a lot of them have been given to the West. Like everybody got to read them after the Soviet Union fell. And there's a ton of that stuff. So what did they see? And how come nobody else saw it? But you see, the truth is that there's actually something in military circles called space angels. These are not unfamiliar. They say that they have caught photographs of them on space stations, that the Hubble telescope has shown evidence of such entities. Now, I can't prove this, and I'm just telling you this is what some proponents are saying. There are other accounts before the sightings that I just described to you. The very first person to ever go into space was a cosmonaut named Yuri Gagarin. And he had an encounter with such a creature in April of 1961. At 2 points during his space flight, he inexplicably went silent and lost contact. When asked later what had happened, he said they thought he had lost consciousness. During hypnotic regression, because the military put him through hypnotic regression to find out what happened when he was unconscious, quote unquote. He claimed to have seen an enormous, mysterious figure floating in space in front of him. And then he heard a voice in his head say, "Do not worry, everything will be fine. You will come back to Earth." And then the apparition disappeared. In 2008, a former member of the Space Shuttle fleet, Clark McClellan, came forward to claim that years earlier he had observed a similar being while looking at monitors of space shuttle missions at the Kennedy Space Center while on duty at Launch Control Center. He claimed that on one of the 27-inch monitors, he not only observed an entity of about 8 to 9 feet in height in the spaceship's payload bay, but that it was interacting with the astronauts. He would say this, and this is a quote: "The ET was standing upright in the space shuttle payload bay, having a discussion with 2 tethered U.S. NASA astronauts. I also observed on my monitors the spacecraft of the ET as it was stabilized safe orbit to the rear of the space shuttle main engine pods. I observed this incident for approximately 1 minute and 7 seconds, plenty of time to memorize what I was observing." He claimed that others had seen the incident too, and that they had all been warned to stay quiet. He stayed quiet for the rest of his career until he retired, at which point he came forward. He would then later also claim that the government has regular dealings with these creatures and that it's all very top secret. He mentioned some sort of alien by the sheer size, and he said he thought it was what they call space angel phenomena. So Major Gordon Cooper, Dr. Edgar Mitchell, and dozens of other NASA and Russian space explorers have no doubt that the Earth is being visited and observed by non-human intelligence with access to technology far beyond our own. What we have failed to recognize is that these may not be aliens from outer space, but rather angelic beings coming and going and interacting with us as they have for millennia. And I think that's one of the best angel stories I ever heard. What do you thought?
Well, the first thought on the last story is, why would an angel need a spaceship?
Well, I mean, like I have to tell you, I've heard many stories of those beings. Look at the Ezekiel and the wheel. What was that? We don't know how they move. Maybe they move in different ways. Maybe they have technology. If you look at the stories of the Nephilim and the fallen watchers and what have you, they taught all kinds of crazy stuff to the humanity, including science, and like there's all these forbidden things that they taught to us: witchcraft, makeup. I had no idea that making up your face, painting your face to be what you are not, was one of the forbidden things. Like there's just so many of those things, and amongst those things were all kinds of alchemies and what
Mhm.
have you, and transmuting metals. So they must have known how to handle them, and why, I don't know. And I don't have all the answers, but I did find that to be a really interesting story.
No, I didn't say I didn't. It
Yeah.
just I just wondered, like I'm thinking back to, oh my goodness, what? Of course, it's fiction. There's a Star Trek
Mhm.
movie where they go past the barrier at the end of the universe and they meet, quote, God, and then God wants to come back on and then Kirk says, what does God need with a starship? So
Yeah.
yeah.
I honestly don't know the answers, but I have heard
Mhm,
other stories
mhm,
where they believed they were angelic beings. And so that's why I said that story near the very beginning was a foreshadowing where he talked about the three clouds that became metallic, and then this being that appeared to be metallic but yet living.
mhm.
I don't know what they are.
But still all very curious.
It is very curious and interesting, and I hope hopeful, because I think we need to remember to have hope and that we're not alone, and that the things that are affecting us now and here and today, there's a whole other side of those things we don't understand, good and evil. So with that, I'm done, my dear.
All right, so I will say good night and give you the last word.
Good night, everybody. And remember to keep everyone in your thoughts and prayers. That good energy is really needed on this planet right now. I'm done.
Okay, cut.